if you understand the landscape, then it's much easier for you to understand the feel and essentially what the company is capable of moving forward with. On top of that, there are a number of metrics that you can use to kind of measure the possibility of success in that market.
Hi everyone, you're listening to Scaling DevTools, the show that investigates how DevTools go from 0 to 1. I'm joined today by Karl Clement, who is the founder of CODEOWNERS, which is a really innovative new tool that helps you understand who owns what part of your code. Karl, thanks so much for joining today.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Karl, could you tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about CODEOWNERS?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Karl, and obviously I'm a engineered-focused COO, which is an odd title, I guess, to do. But my background is actually in commerce, and I taught myself how to engineer when I was about 14 and kind of focused on that. Ended up really, really loving the world of engineering and started building products. And basically came to this point where I met my co-founders. We've worked together for quite some time. We also worked in venture capital for a while. From venture capital, moved on to building a consulting firm, and then brought us today to, which is, we've built a number of products, but one considering called Codex, which we've raised capital for. And now we built another product called CODEOWNERS.
Amazing. And could you tell us a bit about CODEOWNERS?
Yeah, of course. CODEOWNERS is essentially a platform that allows you to map the knowledge of your engineering on top of your engineering team. Now, I guess that sounds a little bit eccentric, but the point here is to understand the ownership and the knowledge across your code base when it comes to who's contributing and who's developed the code.
Really, really cool. And could you give us like some examples of like how this kind of helps teams that use CODEOWNERS?
Yeah, absolutely. So the goal here is to get an observable view of what the actual ownership is of your engineering organization. So by installing the tool, you can understand who's contributed to the code base at what percentages, and also kind of see the distribution. A good example of an output of that is a CODEOWNERS file that you'd find in a GitHub repo. Basically, you can have a sense of responsibility over a section of code. Could be within a repository or across a system. Could be anywhere, even a service catalog. But essentially, the ownership is a level of responsibility of an engineer or an engineering team that can properly manage that piece.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I've never worked in like a big engineering organization, but I imagine there are times when people get woken up by their beeper and then they've got to find like everything's not working and they've got to find the person to wake up and fix it. Or
Yeah, many teams will have incidents happen, 60 to 100 incidents a week. And then some of them will have, 60 to 100 in a month, or depends on varying degrees, but typically they'll use some sort of incident management tool to ping some on-call rotations to be able to find the right person. And, our goal is to really clarify that, really find the exact person that has both the level of responsibility, but also the best understanding, the best knowledge of the code.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. And one of the things this kind of like brings us to a bit is a lot of the guests that we have on are kind of, might be doing like the guys from Clerk Dev who are like kind of reinventing Auth, or, someone that's got a great new code editor. And with those, there's kind of an understood category tool that someone's already using. And I think what's interesting and challenging probably for CODEOWNERS is that you've got this new kind of category that people maybe aren't even aware that they need yet. So I wondered how that's been and like what the process of kind of explaining why people need CODEOWNERS has been.
Yeah, it's definitely an education. Being able to explain what code ownership, its value, as well as just general engineering ownership is an extra level, because you have to assume certain functions and also allow engineers and engineering teams to follow their own process. But as it is today, engineers are served in some sort of hierarchical fashion, and there is responsibility across the team. Whether you're working on a new service or a new code base or a new repository, you will have a team on that repository working, and there's a level of responsibility and shared ownership, but it's not necessarily monitored or managed. Typically, that'll be just spread out in a general fashion. Like you join a Slack group and ping an engineer that you think knows the best, or potentially it's that person that you know has all the answers. You typically will message that person. Well, our goal is to simplify and organize that level to be able to know the level of ownership, but also the level of knowledge across the org. Who knows best? Who has responsibility here? And what are the stakeholders of this piece of code?
Yeah, it's really cool. And I can imagine do you solve that kind of like bus factor, or like alert them that there's just this one person that just does everything?
Yeah, we definitely added. We're working on adding that as a specific metric as well. So if there is an individual or a team that is too essential to the organization, in this case, the bus factor is like very high, which is a very large concern with a lot of organizations, especially if you have an early founder or potentially a early founding engineer that has a ton of implication within the code base. It becomes very difficult to manage that, but not just that, it's distributing that knowledge from that one person to the rest of the team. The bus factor is very high.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think maybe Elon Musk would have really wanted code owners when they were.
Yeah. We actually received a lot of messages when it came up with the actual Twitter debacle in this case, because as soon as all these engineers were now no longer at the organization, it's difficult to understand who knows what, who has the answers, and then especially when you're just as a communicational nightmare trying to figure this out.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And how do you kind of think about your kind of go-to-market when you've got to go through this kind of like maybe education type phase, and probably targeting big companies here?
Yeah, the go-to-market is really exciting, to be honest, because there is a natural kind of sandwich effect that happens, which is the product-led growth motion is trying to create a valuable tool to allow the engineers to essentially do their job better, right? Allow them to have an easier time to complete what they need to complete in a day. But at the same time, the value prop really goes towards a top-down type motion where you have to communicate with a large organization the value that they will receive in order to implement this type of ownership and responsibility across the org. So that value is then provided to a higher up group, which is maybe a VP of engineering, potentially engineering managers, even CTOs. But at the same time, the operational buyer, if you will, is actual engineers, DevOps engineers that are implementing. And one group in particular that we seem to be speaking a lot with are platform engineers, which is an emerging group type. But in this case, platform engineers are typically responsible of implementing services exactly like this to allow their engineering teams to just be able to, handle all their workload as easily as possible.
Interesting. Yeah. And so you are finding that there are people that are doing this on a, regular repeating basis.
Yeah. There's quite a few people. It revolves, it changes quite a bit, but there's certain cases where it could be a staff engineer, or it could be a DevOps engineer or a platform engineer. But in this case, they'd be implementing tools specifically to enable the rest of their team. These people are thinking about this on a daily basis. It may not necessarily be code ownership, might not necessarily be service ownership, but they're definitely thinking of service catalogs and how do they organize everything together. It's really just a big, intricate puzzle to organize an engineering team to be as efficient as possible.
Interesting. And then when you kind of have identified platform engineers as being people that are really thinking about this, how do you find the platform engineers are thinking about it, and how do you reach them?
Great question. There's a number of places you can find platform engineers, but in general is joining the community and really just having conversations with people in the right place. There is a number of Slack channels with platform engineers. There's also groups online. You can find them on Reddit. There's also just, the general top-down type behavior, which you can, find people by prospecting directly into like LinkedIn or other tooling. and find people with either the position of platform engineer or organizations that are hiring in platform engineering. That's quite interesting because it shows a willingness to not necessarily invest, but a willingness to adopt different technologies in order to make their engineering team better. A good example of that is organizations that want to shift left with some of their tooling, or they want to essentially just improve developer experience as a whole. And those organizations are typically more than likely to have a platform engineer or a DevOps engineer that's willing to install tools to make their team more efficient.
Interesting. And how, like, when there's this kind of like general sense that they should improve developer experience, for instance, what are they kind of looking for?
Yeah, there's a number of factors, but what we've seen so far is typically Dora metrics seem to be quite an important guiding principle, I guess, in this case, where they want to include tooling that will help their team just be more effective. A very large one of those is MTTR, which is mean time to resolution. And in this case, a good example of that is when you're resolving incidents, is just being able to resolve the incident as quickly as possible. Now, if developer tooling such as either incident response management or even like CODEOWNERS, for example, to help you resolve the incident faster, that is an important metric to be able to work your way back and understand whether or not those tools are important. So to a manager or say a CTO or VP of engineering, that number or that metric allows them to really identify the return on investment. When you're trying to communicate the value of your tool, that's where the value is tied.
Interesting. So is that how quickly they resolve and show that you're a part of that, essentially? And you mentioned Dora. Could you explain what Dora is?
Yeah, without going too far into detail, Dora metrics is a set of metrics that involves the developer. So if you were to, I definitely recommend going down the rabbit hole of Googling this. But Google also has a great explainer about the different Dora metrics. And typically it's developer efficiency. So you have a number of metrics there that allow you to kind of measure how well your organization is doing. Google also has benchmarks for their engineering team to give you an idea, and you can kind of have comparables. It's different for every organization, obviously, because a larger org with more pods, more engineers, it kind of gets messy, which is why, in implementing these developer experience-based tools will help you just kind of monitor that and get a little closer to a stable benchmark, at least whatever the market is doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And because I've always thought about like, how do I know if a developer team is doing a good job? And I always worked in startups, and I never came up with any or heard of any like metric that I felt would have really encapsulated that we were doing a good job. And I wonder if like, when you look at these kind of metrics and stuff, is it something that you're like kind of keen to go along with and focus in on, or is it like, you at the point of like, well, there are other things, like how are you kind of thinking about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting problem. I think from an organization to organization, it's very different because a benchmark could be great when you're comparing, say, an enterprise to an enterprise in the same vertical, in the same market. In this case, it's very different. If your product is entirely engineering focused and the output of your product is, top notch, it's also the most important factor. It plays a very big part. So your Dora metrics are a lot more important. Meanwhile, if you have a product that's doing quite well and maybe developer pace is a little slower and your velocity is slower, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad team or a bad, like for example, if your mean time to resolution is lower, but you don't seem to have as many incidents and they're less critical, that doesn't seem to matter quite as much. So it really depends on the business. It depends on the product that you're selling. But some organizations are definitely more focused on Dora metrics as a good measure. But I think the benchmark, realistically, your goal should just be to improve, right? Whatever metric that is, just improve your numbers as you go, as you implement new tooling. If it's going down, or I guess, down as a generalized statement, but if it's getting worse, that's definitely not a good thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's an interesting area. There's not, I think you might be one of the first that we've had that's very like kind of driven by this like improving developer experience. And one of the tools that we spoke with offline is Backstage, and how you've been kind of like looking at the Backstage community. And yeah, Backstage is relatively new to me, so I'm kind of curious about like what Backstage is and how you've been kind of like working with that initiative from a lot of companies.
Yeah, Backstage is quite interesting because its grand purpose to implementation is essentially improving developer experience. But there are a number of factors that it does improve once you've fully adopted the technology. And Backstage itself is an open source library from Spotify, essentially allowing you to create a developer hub, if you will. You can use it for a number of things, but essentially the goal of it is just to gather all the engineering knowledge in like one place. So that could be documentation. That could also be, separating your organization or your code into services and different pieces. And it really maps things out for you to understand what's involved in the software, right? If you have a big software company, you have a lot of moving pieces, a lot of services, you have infrastructure as well that's laid on top of that. It's very difficult to manage and to understand, where everything is. And this kind of centralizes everything. It is very customizable as well, which is, allows you to pipe in any other information you have there, including ourselves. We've built a plugin to implement CODEOWNERS data directly into Backstage, because some of that ownership information is important to, the group, but you can essentially pipe in whatever information you want into Backstage just to improve that experience.
Yeah, it's a really kind of smart strategy, I think, to like be kind of joining like an existing like trend movement and kind of making that better as well. And how have you kind of used Backstage's growth as like a driver for yourselves?
Well, it's been an interesting conversation with some companies. Backstage implementation is essentially a signal that a company is willing to invest in the organization, but the developer experience as a whole, which is great because for us, it gives us a signal that there is some general understanding as well for the tooling, rather than your run-of-the-mill engineering team that just, write code, ship code, write code, ship code. There's a lot of moving pieces, and the larger your company grows, especially mid-market or enterprise companies, the engineering team is vast, massive companies that have different groups and pods and different verticals within an organization. And it's almost impossible to understand the full spectrum. That's why in theory, if you're implementing Backstage, you have an understanding that, things need to be optimized, things need to be organized. And there's a level of responsibility across the org, which really helped us understand that someone who is implementing Backstage is also curious about ownership, curious about team responsibility. And it kind of goes hand in hand in this case.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a really, really smart way to like think of like visible ways that you could determine the mindset, which is often very hard to kind of understand of different companies.
Absolutely. And that's where the product-led growth type motion typically happens, especially for mid-marketed enterprise. You have to work with existing tooling that is familiar to the group, right? If an engineer is familiar with the tool, it then helps them understand. There might be a bit of cognitive bias there, but it's just a little bit of familiarity makes it feel a lot more palatable.
Yeah, 100%. Like none of us want to do anything different, right? Unless we're dragged kicking and screaming, or it's so good that we just have to do something new. Yeah, that's a really good approach. And Karl, you mentioned briefly that you had like a kind of a VC stint before CODEOWNERS, as well as running your own business and stuff. Could you tell us a bit about like what you've brought from being on that side of the table to now founding your own thing?
Absolutely. I think that the interesting piece with my experience with venture capital is that many organizations, typically when you're building a product and you're putting it into market, you're always thinking of a scratch your own itch type behavior, or potentially it's just you found opportunity within a specific company, or it could just be a eureka moment where you've noticed a gap or some sort of opportunity in market. And the venture capital side essentially teaches you to understand the global system around it more so than the actual execution of the product. Now, when you're doing venture investing, the interesting thing is there are a number of factors that make you make that decision and move forward. But one of them is understanding the landscape. And if you understand the landscape, then it's much easier for you to understand the feel and essentially what the company is capable of moving forward with. On top of that, there are a number of metrics that you can use to kind of measure the possibility of success in that market. And if you're seeing other companies in the same landscape, you have a better understanding of what's possible and also your competition. So if you're building a product, you're very myopic, you're looking at this one problem in this one place, trying to understand it and then move forward, but you don't generally have as good of an understanding of the market and who's at play here, who are the main acquirers, who are the big moving pieces. And basically the venture capital allows you to kind of figure out those moving pieces and really understand the market, understand how products are moving, what are the tailwinds that are going to pull your product forward. AI most recently is definitely one of those tailwinds where if you learn to work with AI or implement generative AI in any way, shape, or form, it'll help you move forward. And that venture capital eye kind of allows you to pick and choose and understand the market.
Yeah, very interesting. And as someone that's always like thinking of ideas and trying to come up with my own dev tools, could you give any examples or like even speaking about code owners, about how you thought about it when you were kind of like evaluating whether you wanted to throw yourself behind this direction?
Absolutely. Our original product was Codex, which allowed to document as you code, which was an interesting piece and it's a necessary piece. But that's when we started to see opportunities in other places where code ownership and code responsibility was the root cause. And then at that point, we were able to identify different people working in the same observability space. And in this case, when you start seeing observability, you start seeing big players like Datadog or Splunk, or big players that have been in the market for years, really, really understanding this. And their move towards observability as a whole is interesting because it allows you to see what larger companies like enterprise, mid-market are really looking for. They're looking for a general understanding of the full spectrum. Like what is going on in my organization? What is going on in my system? And that was an interesting piece because from a code ownership standpoint, we saw an opportunity, but also a need for a sense of responsibility and a sense of ownership and understanding of what your engineering team is building, right? Again, with, same thing with tailwinds for AI, for example, there's a lot of things we weren't able to do in the past. You couldn't necessarily look at a code base and understand exactly how it was built without going through every little git commit and really understanding like, okay, this person added this, they added this code here and here and here, which gave us this big product. But now with certain technologies, we could figure out a lot of things. You can work your way back and understand the history, understand the observability of your system.
Interesting. So it's like you're kind of the production side of things, like external face, like their Datadog and stuff is showing you how it's running and like that errors and stuff like that. And you're more like how was it built? Who built it? Sort of.
Yeah, it essentially validates your market position, if you will, and it validates the direction. In this case, a lot of large players are going into this space, and it allows you to understand that, okay, if they're going to this space, then that means that there's importance here. And my solution in particular solves a pain point in this space, right? If you were building a particular product in a space that no one is, there is a chance that it works out, but you are also reducing your odds of understanding, especially from a B2B standpoint. If you're selling a consumer product and it's just a wow effect, and no one's ever heard of it before, But you go and you build this, present it to the market, everyone loves it because it's just the coolest thing since sliced bread. That's a different perspective than from a B2B standpoint. B2B, it has to map directly to something they are currently doing or they need to do in order for you to have a valuable product. If they aren't doing it or they don't intend to do it, then there's no value tied to it. And it's very difficult for them to calculate the ROI on a product.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important point. Yeah. Is there like direct competitors and stuff for code owners?
I don't want to speak too quickly, but not right now.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is I'd say the most direct competitor is just an engineering organization with proper organization. If you have a proper, hierarchical pattern, you can understand your company. Small pods can communicate effectively together and really, keep moving. But the realistic situation here is that's impossible to maintain. You can if you have a really small org, if you're in the same room. Like even on our team, as we grow, we're having difficulties understanding who did what, who's responsible for what, who knows what.
Yeah, 100%. That's I think that's the challenge of a lot of DevTools anyway. Even in Auth, right? I think everyone's the main competitor is just people doing it themselves. Yeah, Karl, I think we're coming to the end of the time. So I wondered if you've got any kind of key takeaways that you would advise either yourself a few years ago or someone else who's maybe doing something slightly different to you.
Absolutely. My biggest recommendation for anyone is to not necessarily focus on the distribution portion of the method you're getting to market, but my biggest advice would be to focus on your ICP, that group, that person that you're trying to go and talk to. Really make sure to spend the most time that you can in discovery with those people, because really understanding their needs and what they're willing to work with and what are their pain points really matter, right? You might be the entire time you might be talking to, say, a site reliability engineer, and you think that this person is the right person for the problem, but this person never really resonates with the problem. And then you go and speak to a different person, say a platform engineer in our case, and then it's a perfect match, right? There are some situations where you need to understand the person you're selling to, both whether that's an operational buyer or it could potentially be just like an economic buyer. So someone who's willing to write the check, hand over the credit card. But you have to understand those people in order to best fit the value, right? You have to be fixing a problem if you want someone to pay for it.
Great. Thank you, Karl. And if people want to learn more about code owners or about Karl, where can they learn more?
Definitely check out codeowners.com. We're building the platform. It's working. We're changing it constantly. So please do check in. And you can check out my personal Twitter. It's KarlClement, Karl Clement. Really appreciate it.
Amazing. Thanks, Karl. And thanks for joining us. And thanks everyone for listening. Okay, I think I thanked you twice there, Karl, but thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you, Jack.